Hi everyone, welcome to this launch, welcome to this event that is sponsored by the Paris Peace Forum, my organization, by BCG and as well as OCP UM6P. And we are here to launch one of the stages of the Atlas rocket. Atlas is an initiative that we started at the Paris Peace Forum last June on African agriculture, along with a number of partners. My name is Justin Weiss. I'm the Director General of the Paris Peace Forum, an organization that was born in 2018, and that does two things. One, it does an annual event in Paris every November 11, where we gather heads of state and government, the private sector, NGOs, foundations, experts, academics, and others working on global governance issues. We use that convening power to try and tackle some of the world's largest challenges in terms of global governance, given the demise or the difficulties of multilateralism. And the second thing we do year-round is we have a policy department working on discrete initiatives. Some of them are on tech, on AI, on cybersecurity. One of them is on global health. One of them is on critical minerals. And one of them is Atlas. And Atlas is meant to try and reconcile the views from North and South on African agriculture. It's also meant to encourage investment in African agriculture. And that's precisely what we are here to launch more specifically. The 2x30, I should say, campaign, which is meant to double investment in African agriculture by 2030. As many of you know, since we are in a community of specialists, African agriculture is both a key for development, especially for solving a number or reaching a number of the SDGs, and a more and more forgotten priority in the international agenda. It has not nearly received the amount of importance and attention that it deserved, and since the 1980s, investment in African agriculture has tended to decrease rather than increase. A bit later on, Patrick Dupoux from BCG will explain in greater detail what the situation is exactly and how the 2x30 challenge, in a way, can help us reach that. In order to reach that challenge, we have a number of organizations that have rallied around Atlas and these particular initiatives. Many of them are here in the room, be they international organizations, African organizations in particular, governments, and others. There's another thing that we're launching just today, and that's why I have this paper in hand, and you'll find it on the table. We're also launching the Atlas Investment Barometer today, because you can't govern what you don't know or what you cannot quantify or evaluate. And so what we set out to do, especially with the help of BCG, was to try and quantify what goes into African agriculture, what doesn't go into African agriculture. It's estimated that it would need $200 billion a year in order to reach its full potential, thereby producing positive externalities for the rest of the SDGs. And in order to measure this investment and the need for investment, we're launching this barometer, which you can reach by the QR code that is provided here. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for coming. I'll now leave the floor to Isman El Wafi from CJIR, which is one of the most important organizations with which we are partnering. Floor is yours, Isman.
Thank you very much. Merci infiniment. And sorry, I'm sitting so I could read my notes as well. So good afternoon, colleagues. Really pleasure to be with you here as we are launching the 2x20 challenge. And really, I think it's really a bold move. We all agree that we need much more funding to make the transformation right in Africa. So let me give you some numbers. Africa, it is at a critical juncture. So we have about 60% of the arable land, it's in Africa. But yet, we have huge food insecurity challenges. 1 in 5 Africans goes to bed hungry, and 140 million people face acute food insecurity. And always when we talk about acute food insecurity, it means that people could die from it. That's how bad it is. So these numbers represent real lives, families, and communities that are struggling to meet the most basic human needs, such as access to food. The challenge ahead is really intimidating. So the numbers right now look very bad. By 2030, we're going to have 118 million extremely poor Africans that will be exposed to drought, flood, and other extreme heat or other extreme weather. These climatic shocks, coupled with the fact that 2/3 of Africa agricultural land is impacted by soil degradation, make the task of achieving food security even more urgent. Alarmingly, 80% erosion is linked to agriculture, highlighting the serious need for sustainable land management practices in our continent. Increasingly, investment in African agriculture is a necessity. So an initiative like 20 by 30 Challenge, it's pivotal. It's a first step towards building productive, resilient, and sustainable agri-food systems. But achieving this goal will require more than just financial commitment. It calls for the implementation of effective and efficient innovations and scaling them to ensure that every dollar contributes meaningfully to transforming agriculture in Africa. That is why today's event is so important. It is a platform for development, public and private sector to come together, mobilize resources, and co-create solutions. Our collaboration and partnership are critical because the challenges we face are far too complex to any one organization to solve alone. And if you talk to many Africans, they will say many of us have been in the continent for 50 years, some of us 100 years, but the development did not happen. So there is something wrong in the way we did it for the last 50 or 100 years, and we need to do it differently. So at CGR, we have always embraced the power of partnership with a global network of over 3,000 partners institutions spanning government, NGOs, and the private sector. We co-create innovation solutions and scale them to deliver impact where it is needed the most. Backed by a dedicated team of 10,000 staff, including many on-the-ground researchers, CGR operates in over 80 low and middle-income countries. Many of them are in Africa. Our work is grounded in action and results. For instance, through the Technology for African Agricultural Transformation, famous as TAT program, CGR led efforts to deliver climate-smart seeds to 12 million farmers in 27 countries within just 3 years. In the wheat compact alone, over 30 heat-tolerant varieties were introduced, benefiting 1.5 million people. This success was not achieved in isolation. We worked closely with partners to train local extension systems and farmers on optimal seed usage, boosting both yields and climate resilience. Another impactful initiative is our climate-smart villages and valleys innovation, which serves as a real-life lab to test tailored strategies such as drip irrigation, resilient crops, agroforestry, and renewable energy. In West Africa, this approach led to 94% increase in rice yields and boosted farmer net income by about $270 per hectare. We are also empowering the next generation of agriculture innovators through the Accelerated Impact Platform. In just 2 years, this platform has supported more than 100 youth-led African agriculture startups, equipping them with training, boot camps, product validation, and technical assistance. These startups have accessed markets, secured funding, and scaled their venture, all with the goal of improving small-scale farmers' production, livelihood, and well-being. So despite these promising advancements, African agriculture remained critically underfunded. Despite global agriculture accounting for 1/3 of global food production, but receives only 1.5, 1.7 of climate finance. And that's most of that money, hardly 5% of it make it to the small-scale farmers. So doubling investment in agriculture R&D is necessary to provide the resources needed to tackle climate challenge, restoring degraded land, and uplifting millions of farmers in Africa, majority of them smallholder. As a matter of fact, based on studies and data, we know that every dollar that you put in research and development in agriculture bear $10 back as a return on investment. So it is very important, as we are talking about doubling investment in African agriculture system, that we do that through innovation and through really customizing the solution. The solution, in many ways, over the years as well, as I said, did not make it to the farmers. So we need really to focus on co-creation and making sure that the solution is a good fit for purpose in that ecosystem, in that culture, in the farmers that working on the ground. Thank you very much. Should I introduce Patrick? Yeah? So over to you, Patrick. You have been already introduced by Justin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Isma. And I will take that because as a normal consultant, I have slides. So let me give you a few facts and introduce Atlas and the 2x30 challenge, where it comes from, why we believe it's a critical one. So we are in this SDG tent. There are many rooms, many sessions. Statistically, we should have half of them dedicated to the African agriculture. And as you can see, it's the only session that is talking about the African agriculture. And why should we have half of these sessions focusing on African agriculture or agri-food systems? It's because half of the world's SDGs are directly linked to the ability to make progress on the African agri-food systems. And that's this dichotomy, which is, or this mismatch, which is the starting point of the Atlas initiative by the Paris Peace Forum and the 2x30 challenge. Basically, and I will go through that, between 30 and 60% of the SDG gaps globally are directly linked to African agri-food systems. But we only invest 0 point something on the global investments. Even the ODA, the Overseas Development Aid, only 3% goes to African agri-food sectors. And within Africa, if you take private and public investment, only 5% goes to African agri-food sector. So basically, half of your problems are linked to one issue, and you only put between 1 and 3% of your resources to this issue. So there is this major mismatch. So if you look at the SDGs, I'm not taking the 17 of them, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No poverty, 50% of poverty in the world are in Africa and very much linked to African rural areas or the ability to improve the yields, the performance of the African agri-food sector. Hunger, 60% of food insecurity, again, is in Africa, very much linked to our ability to improve the performance of the systems. And it goes on, health, education, gender equality, decent work, climate action. So if there is one area where we should double down to close the SDG gap, this is the right one. And it's a triple win. It's a win for Africa. Of course, higher productivity means reducing food insecurity, food sovereignty. We saw during the Ukraine crisis the impact. The biggest impact was actually in Africa, and a number of countries actually went into severe budget problems because of the lack of food sovereignty. When we talk about climate impact, what is the real problem of climate? The biggest problem of climate will be in those areas of the world where we will not be able to grow food anymore. And most of them are actually in Africa. So if you think about where should we invest about climate, we should actually focus on African food sectors. And economic growth, it's a win for the world, because if African agriculture and food systems are more performing, we actually improve food security for the whole world, and Africa can actually be can feed the world. Climate action, displacement, the climate refugees, most of them will come from the areas in Africa which will be the most impacted by climate change. It's also a win for private investors. There is a lot of opportunities linked to improving the overall African agri-food systems. So, critical, half of the SDGs, lots of opportunity, yet we underinvest. So if you look at this chart, so you see an increase here. It's the absolute number of or amounts invested by public sector in Africa in agri-food. But if you look at the yellow line, it's the share of African government investments. And you see this is decreasing over time. We thought that it should be 10%. Only 2 countries out of 54 have reached the 10%. We are more in the 5 to 6. And you could think that African public sector will spend a higher share of its public investments into agri-food. Well, actually, it's the least of all the regions in the world. LATAM is at 8%, Brazil 11%, South Asia 11%, and so on. So there is a gap in the public sector investments. There is a gap in the private sector investment, and this is why the PPF decided to launch first this initiative on Atlas, that was last year. Africa can be a major agricultural power. About 25 organizations, including ourselves, including most of the people in this room, signed this call for action. Atlas was launched in June 2024 with 30 members. And now we are launching the 2830, which I will come back to. So the objective, advocacy to increase investments, advocacy towards governments, advocacy towards the international development community, towards private sector. Drive consensus on priorities. So it's not only about investing more, as you said, it's about investing better. So we need to drive some consensus, basic ones, about what do we mean by sustainable agriculture. The role of soil health, critical to, you mentioned it, for the sustainability of the African agriculture. And the last one, I'm sure in this community, many have seen hundreds of initiatives launched at COP, at UNGA, Climate Week, Davos, and no one is measuring. We want to measure. We want to set up this investment barometer so we can track progress and measure how we progress. So the 2830 challenge, how do we double investments into the African food sectors by 2030? And I see old friends coming in the room. So in the last 2 years, the average investment into the African agri-food sectors were around $50 billion US, both private, public, ODA. And the idea is, we believe, the estimated gap is we should reach 200. Let's be realistic, let's reach 100, and a lot of progress will be made. And we need to progress on all fronts. Private investment. It's 4% of private funding in Africa goes to agriculture. We need to reach 8%. So that will be the biggest increase. Public expenditures, I mentioned that. The idea is to reach 10%, which is the CADEP target. And the last one is development funding. As you see, it's small, but it had a multiplier effect on all the rest by bringing innovative instruments like de-risking and other type of subsidies. So, 2830, we want to measure. We have created this barometer, which you can access, which will track investments. I'm not asking you to read all the lines, don't worry. But we are going to publish that every 6 to 12 months. Investment by country, by sectors, by stakeholder, by topic, and just track progress. Are we progressing? Are we in line with the commitments? The advocacy campaign is to make sure we will hopefully have a session in the Financing Commons in Cape Town, but also make sure that the international organizations are supporting this campaign. So what's next? Mobilization against the 2830, in favor of the 2830. Continue the advocacy activities, the various leading forums and others, and we will publish and refine the investment barometer to track progress. So we now have a great panel. I think everyone is here. NDD is here also. I think she was late. So we have Raj. I think, Raj, you will facilitate. I think you can. So, Raj, you're a president and editor-in-chief of DevEx. We have Dr. Agnès Kalibata, who is the president of the Agro organization. I can see her. We have Ilyas El-Fali from OCP Group, one of the major investors in the African agri-food value chains. My colleague Shalini, who's been working on that topic for years. Alvaro Lario from IFAD. And we have NDD, but I'm not sure. I know she was late. Okay, she's on the way. So.
Thank you, Patrick.
I was just following around there.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. You can all hear me, more or less, yeah? Good to be with all of you, and I'll ask our panelists just come up and sit. We'll get started with that, Ndidi, but she'll join us shortly, it sounds like. You know, Justin always gets me to see things differently. So let me just see if I have this straight. We are in the SDG tent, but it's not a tent. We're at the Paris Peace Forum, but we're in Davos. And we're talking about solving global challenges, but we're focused on African agriculture. And I always come away from these kind of sessions with a new idea, and I hope you do too, because this is new, this sense that there is a real opportunity right in front of us, even in a moment of great challenge. And maybe we start in that moment of challenge a little bit. I just put it out there, because as we're gathered in this room, as some of you were sipping champagne, I think Donald Trump was just inaugurated. I live in Washington, D.C. I'm happy to be here in Davos, where it's a lot warmer in many senses of that word. You know, I can imagine, I know some of the people on his team, and I can imagine they would see this and say, well, don't expect that new money to come from us, right? We may be in a period when it's very tough. You know this, Alvaro, very tough. It's already been tough to raise funds from European donors. The US has so far not been as hard, but it may become similar to many European donors. So we're in this moment of enormous opportunity, as Patrick laid out. It's right in front of us. We ought to grab it. How do we actually make that work at this time, given the realities of the funding picture we face, and given that we know something now that's a little bit different than we did had we had this conversation 10 years ago, that there are new ways to innovate around finance. There's new ways to fund things. Can I start with you on this, Alvaro, just to get us started?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Clearly, I mean, the pitching that we just saw is what we tend to do over the last decades, so that's very helpful to see also more of a coalition. I think the key part of what you just mentioned, and the business case is very clear, is probably how the actors were responding. And I think the last one in terms of the flows is very important. ODA is not going to solve this. It's very clear in terms, if you saw about the 7 to 10 billion. Public sector, we've known for a long time that they have been underinvesting, especially in Africa. At the same time, the fiscal space is getting narrower and narrower. For example, Malawi, Angola, Nigeria, Kenya, 25% of their government revenue goes to pay interest debt, so it's going to be difficult to see that increase. So clearly it's the private sector that we need to talk, and not only the very global, but actually the local private sector. We have, fun enough, worked with BCG on transforming our business model also. For the first time, we will be also co-investing with the private sector. It's not only talking about partnerships or catalyzing, actually putting our money to the risk and also to do direct investments. That's an evolution, especially for a DFI. And we are not seeing it that, I would say, missing middle, hidden middle, first mile, being invested by the other MDBs. If you look at the MDBs, it's very clear that they're talking about the big commodity firms, they're talking about the big type of investments, not at the local type of level, which is where it's actually needed and where it's needed to be catalyzed. And I think that's the key part of what business models. This is great, but how can we ensure that we are bringing the tools and the business model that will enable the ecosystem at the local level, at the rural level to happen. With this, just a couple of perhaps points. We will be launching our rural development report around the finance for development that will happen in Spain, which is the big event this year after the billions from trillions of Addis Ababa in 2015. And we have seen that that billions to trillions has not happened. We're all very hopeful that it will happen with the private sector. It has not happened. The MDBs have not reformed themselves to be able to work at this local level, still at the very big level. So let's see what's come out of there. For us, it's going to be about financing food systems. Our rural development report will be launched before. And then just to finalize, in terms of the investment barometer, there will be also another summit, not to talk about summits, which is the FSS +4, the Finance Food Systems, which was led by Dr. Kalibata. And one of the tools actually that has been developed over the last year was tracking the financial flows on the public, development, and private. So it would be very good to partner with the Paris Peace Forum and BCG on what we have already done in certain countries and see how we can amplify it and come together with the World Bank. Right now it's being done by the World Bank and IFAD in the Food System Hub. So it would be very interesting to see how we can partner. Thank you.
We're going to come back to some of those themes around the ecosystem, the DFIs, the MDBs, the IFADs of the world. Where do they actually all fit together? But Agnes, you probably still have scars from hosting that event at the UN Food Security Forum, which you ably did, and it was a challenging group to bring together, especially because of exactly this issue. Private sector, what is their role? It's highly controversial on some of these themes. You've been working on trying to improve African agriculture systems for a long time. So what is the core reason why these gaps still exist?
Thank you. Thank you, and good to see you all. First of all, let's say that the effort on the Food System Summit was not in vain. What? When you look at what's happening around all of us, when you look at what people are doing today, it's actually probably the most important thing we did that time, because there's really a lot of energy and momentum around innovating around food systems that probably wouldn't have happened that way. So that's one. Now, for the African continent, there are a number of things. When you look back, one of the biggest lessons I keep saying that we got from some of the crises that happen, that impact Africa from outside, actually wake you up to the opportunities of the African continent, right? The fact that we were still able to eat during some of these crises. We're still able to find food. There are things we are not tapping into in the African continent when it comes to what we can do from a food security perspective and from a food production perspective. There are models of working with smallholder farmers, who is who we are. We are not going to run away from that fact. We have to find ways of working with them and making that work. Working with small businesses, working with smallholder farmers. In the last AFS, we showed that African small businesses are moving 300 million metric tons of food around the continent every day within Africa. But still, we are importing $34 billion worth across 4 commodities only. So the gaps are around 2 major areas, just to go back to your question. First of all, just appreciating and understanding that we have to work with smallholder farmers as businesses. IFAD spends a lot of money in that space. Working with small businesses, you do know that there are models that work. We need to scale those models in ways that can work for the continent. We need to invest in the affordability of financing outside what IFAD and others do. It's just very expensive to do business on the continent in terms of financing. So I don't know the basis of that, but all of you that work in the financial sector know.
We'll talk about that.
The third one and the last one, probably most important now, is investing in the climate and the climate issues and the opportunities to present. 60% of Africa's agriculture is degraded. Africa owns 60% of unused agricultural land. These are all opportunities for us to do things differently. So yes, gaps exist, but opportunities are even bigger.
I want to bring Shalini and Ilyas into the discussion on one insight you raised, Agnes, which is this point that we should see smallholder farmers as businesses. Because I think if you see them as businesses, it changes your perspective maybe about what some of the solutions can be. This is something you work on at BCG.
Yeah.
What are some of the private sector-led initiatives that are unlocked when you change their mindset from smallholder farmers being sort of beneficiaries of aid to businesses in their own right?
One of the, we start many of these conversations by saying the farmer has to be at the center. Part of putting the farmer at the center is actually starting with the farmer and asking them, how do you make money? And what are you spending on, and what are you making, and what do you need to make more money? And there are some tremendous insights. So as BCG, we've done farmer surveys now in multiple countries and sort of, deep analysis, just building out the P&Ls of farmers, smallholder farmers, large farmers, across the board. And what you find is they're very pragmatic people. They're not, making these decisions based on, oh, I've been doing this thing for generations. They're practical, and they're going after the best economic case that they see in front of them. And right now what we find is that when you actually break out that P&L, a farmer's transition, for instance, into climate smart agriculture actually yields higher profitability for them. There's a 2, 3, 4 year period of investment. In fact, for smallholder farmers in developing countries, that period of investment is even shorter. And then they get to 60 to 140% higher profitability with climate smart practices. On top of that, they're going to be more resilient. With better soil health, they can add another crop into the rotation. And so the challenge to businesses is not to think about doing things to smallholder farmers, but to understand that there's actually a real business case to invest. And what you need is not subsidies forever. What you need is transition financing. Transition financing that will help a farmer become resilient, become productive, and the returns are clearly there when that happens. The problem is that a lot of the programs, and this is not just private sector, I think we're all responsible for this to some extent. Our programs do not start with scale. They start with thinking about pilots, and so they're never set up for scale. They do not start with a systems thinking. So it's like, I want to try this thing, and the next farm, Nestle is trying something, the third farm, Danone, is trying something, and somewhere else, FCDO is trying something. We don't take a systems lens, and we don't stack. So a farmer is saying, unless the financing is stacked, and I get all the pieces that I need, I'm not going to jump into this pond just because you've shown me the first little bit of it, right? So we've got to collectively get a lot better at collaboration. I know it's a depressing time in many ways, and we've got we've got an uphill climb ahead. But we need to increase the capital, but we have capital today that is not being efficiently deployed because we are not collaborating as much with each other as we could.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and I know it was in Patrick's slides, this idea we have to spend better, not just more. Yep. The more is important, but better too. It sounds like it's a pretty clear financing problem, right? If we have confidence in the market and believe you can get to those kinds of rates of return, it's a short financing window that you need to make happen. But I guess that problem is a scale problem. We have these transaction costs when you're dealing with millions of smallholder farmers, and you can't make much impact until you get into hundreds of thousands at least, right? So OCP, Ilyas, the place you are a managing director, it's one of the world's most important fertilizer companies. You do so much more than that in green hydrogen and other areas. But you have to think about all of these small businesses added up together as a market. How do you approach that market? How do you see them as a financing opportunity for your business?
Well, yes, I mean, I agree with all what my colleague just said, and most importantly that we need to see first the smallholder farmer as a business, right, and put in him or her at the center, right, and we need to look at the problem as a systemic problem, right. So let me just mention maybe two examples of coming from our experience in various parts in various regions in Africa. First one is what we call the agri-finance platform. It's an initiative that we launched last year with, in partnership with the IFC, building a platform that catalyzes investment in value chain. So first, we address the problem as a value chain problem, focusing on where the pain points and bottlenecks are. And one of the examples that was first implemented is the rice value chain in Côte d'Ivoire, for example. So we had to bring together a startup that's from Kenya that's offering insurance, yield-based insurance to farmers, bring in off-takers guaranteeing offtake to the farmer to give that incentive to grow more, and bring in banks for whom the investment becomes de-risked and they can afford to. So we need this kind of approaches when you bring various stakeholders from different industries around the table in order to de-risk value chains. Second example is one of the startups we're investing in Nigeria called Thrive Agric, and their model is somehow the same, optimizing the allocation of risk in the value chain so that the farmer can afford to apply the practices and buy inputs. So they start with off-taking having a contract, an off-take contract with the farmer. They buy inputs and they support the farmer to grow, right? And of course, because they have a track record of quadrupling yields, they can raise money and advance the inputs to the farmer. So these are local innovation in terms of business models that we see emerging in various parts of Africa that need investment. We think a lot of investment in infrastructure, in logistics and so on, which are important, but we need also to funnel investment into those emerging innovative business models.
You want to say something about this, Agnes? Go ahead.
No, thank you. No, I mean, I'm really just excited. I know IFAD and us have been on the same side forever, but to see OCP and BCG come on board, talking about, first of all, smallholder farmers at the center of small business, and then at the center, and then the ecosystem part. Now, we've been working forever to try to make that case for smallholder farmers as a business. Africa needs to be looked at, not from the way we know agriculture works there, but from the smallholder perspective and as a business, and that's great. But it hasn't worked until what you're talking, the ecosystem approach and the scale. So we've developed this ecosystem approach and scale and demonstrated that there's money to make for businesses. So we don't de-risk smallholder farmers, we de-risk businesses. That's Agra, that's what we do. So we go in this geography, and value chains is a great way to go about it. But beyond value chains, African farmers have hundreds of value chains, right? So we go into these geographies and care about every farmer that is not making money, irrespective of the value chain they're in. Then with that ecosystem approach, we do two things. We engage around extension. We tell every business, if you're interested in business here, we'll do the extension because it's the weakest link. That's number one. So we've introduced the VBA model to do the extension. Then we keep monitoring what else is weak. It's the bringing farmers together. It's giving you the reason to be there. We don't do anything that is less than 300,000 farmers. And that's great because for me, that's an assurance that every farmer is involved. We've seen this change farmers' lives, but more importantly, for every dollar, businesses have invested, and commercial businesses have invested $12. So this ecosystem part that you bring OCP, you bring seed companies, you bring all these businesses that look at the 300,000 farmers as a captive market is very critical, number one. Number two, it has the ability to scale because you've created a strong enough momentum on the ground. So it's working.
So I know Alvaro wants to jump in first. So let me just ask you this, Alvaro, because we've heard about the ecosystem, we heard about collaboration. We started off a little bit in your comments talking about the broader financing ecosystem, the MDBs, the DFIs. IFAD has a particular place because you're focused on the smallest farmers. Collaboration sounds nice. Like, why don't we do it today? You also probably have to give up some control if you're going to collaborate. You have to say, we're not going to do certain things that we do. We're not going to do that pilot. We are going to work with the ecosystem. We're going to put the value chain company first and figure out what's their business and how do we invest in that. What do we have to do in the international financial architecture, of which IFAD is a key part, to reform the way it works to achieve what we've just heard on this panel?
So that's a very good question. I spend most of the time thinking about scale, and let me put you why. Last year, I remember very vividly when I met with one of the biggest companies, with the CEO, and when he was discussing his value chain and the type of farmers, he was talking about 15,000 farmers, and I'm talking in our case an outreach of 100 million. So clearly the scale and what we're trying to do is different. Not that it's not valid and it's not important, but the scale is the challenge. So what actors are very important? Before it was mentioned the financing common, which is where all of the public development banks come together. And actually, if you think about agriculture development banks, public development banks actually, their disbursements is 10% of the GDP of the world, 10%. So you see already extremely powerful tools for governments in terms of using it. But we know that a lot of the agricultural development banks are either undercapitalized, have a lot of issues with capital in the governments. But for us, currently, one of the ways of partnering is actually with public development banks, especially in Latin America, as a way of trying to scale up credit, scale up practices, scale up insurance at this level, because they know a lot of the local actors, the farmers' organizations that we have, but we try to connect them. So the big question still keeps being scale and at what level. And I think Agnes put a lot of examples, but I think the mindset needs to shift from technical assistance at the $500,000, $1 million level. That does not solve anything. It's not even putting a band. I mean, we need to think about what type of models and platforms can get us, in our case, to the hundreds of millions, in the case of banks, to the billions. And I think that's the question.
Yeah, it's a fair question. If you're the World Bank, you might be used to doing a loan and say, we're going to go give a loan to the government for a project. But in this new model, the way you're all thinking about it, you would instead say, how do we transform the entire agricultural industry of a country or even a region, an entire value chain, right, of a product, let's say. And you can't just write a loan for that. That doesn't, that's not a one-off project. It's a different way of thinking that has to maybe put the MDB or the DFI no longer in the driver's seat themselves, but someone else is in the driver's seat. Charlene, what do you think about that and whatever you wanted to come in on?
I wanted to reflect on maybe a couple of things related to that. One is, at no point is this conversation on how do we get this much finance going to be sufficient with just public and philanthropic, and we need private capital to start flowing in. And so part of what we need in this discussion, this goes back to the point around creating the stack of capital. So this ecosystem model is absolutely important and critical, because what it has is, it is at scale enough that a private capital player can actually build a model, underwrite it, and it's actually scaled enough that they can say, okay, I'm not trying to figure out a whole new financing mechanism for 10,000 farmers here and 20,000 there. It's at scale enough. Yeah. But it's also not saying create a solution for the world. It is actually focused enough as well that you can take specific risks of that area, of that context into mind, which is why it's really powerful. And then going from there to then be able to take the capital sources that we do have today and not just say, what does the system need, but what is the full stack the system's going to need? What of that is going to come? What is the catalytic part that's going to come from multilaterals and so on? What is the stack that the private capital has to bring in, and how do we bring them to the table here? We need a bank at this panel.
And more of the challenge, you tell me, more of the challenge I think might be at the bottom of that stack, meaning you've got to get the policy right, you've got to get the first loss, the guarantees.
Exactly. Insurance.
Right, those are the things that seem to be where because the private sector will come if you create those opportunities. You tell me, you're in the private sector.
No, I agree. I mean, we need collaboration, right? At OCP, of course, our main objective is really to find scalable models and concepts that can be applied, right, and that can drive collective action, right? But I think it starts also with a vision, right, in order to federate and mobilize all the energies. And it goes back to what kind of green revolution we want for Africa, or Africa can have, right? And I think that Africa is able to find its own way. We're not obliged to follow the same path as the green revolutions of the last century. And as far as fertilization is concerned, for example, we don't have to apply the same recipes as in the past. Today we can afford, for example, to be more customized, to have bespoke fertilization that is adapted to the soils, that is adapted to the plants. And that's not only a sustainability issue, it's also an efficiency issue, because today we are losing part of the nutrients that the farmer is paying for. And today we can do that because today we have technology that can support that. It was not the case in the past. But I think, in order to go there, my point is that Africa needs also to choose its own way and to build some common vision to mobilize actors across the board.
Right, I think a key question is who is in the driver's seat? You know, in your case, you're trying to build a market. You're looking to these smallholder farmers as a customer, but there's too many for you to go sell to. So those value chain intermediaries are really valuable, right? So who's driving it? Is it the value chain intermediaries or is it government? When you talk about Africa, it's a lot of countries. Is it Africa Union? You know, they have a new strategy, right? The Kampala statement on, what's it called? The Kampala Declaration? Right, by 2035, a new vision for agriculture in the continent. So who's driving this bus? Who do you think, Agnes?
So we've been thinking for some time around that scale question. How do you move from 300,000 farmers that we are able to do with partnerships at local level to national scale? What we've done is think about what the money that IFAD does, what the money that World Bank does, what the money that African Development Bank does. These are institutions that work with the governments to get them to achieve scale and to get them to do certain things, deal with policy challenges, deal with the enabling environment in terms of whatever is needed in the agricultural sector. So we have this forum on the African continent, the Africa Food Systems Forum. Last year alone, 3 countries launched, so I'm saying that the driver is the government. 3 countries launched their national strategies that are anchored on evidence of what is needed, research was done, experts were engaged and all that. But we then recognize that no single institution around the table has the ability to fund that, not those governments themselves, not IFAD, but the government needs to bring their partners around the table and present their case. So these 3 countries presented their cases, and actually, one of the countries we're going to be discussing later tonight is Tanzania, that has mobilized 600 million from the last year, the year before last's investments. IFAD is a major contributor to that. All these partners are major contributors. What it does is deal with those challenges that private capital can't deal with. What it does is lay the ground for private capital. The meeting we have tonight, and I know many of you are going to be there, is about just presenting this case to you, these cases to you. These countries have mobilized the resources to do the public part. What do you need as private sector to be able to come in and do your part as private sector? So that's the conversation we want to have. Because actually, countries are getting awakened to the fact that they need to do their part, they're mobilizing the resources, but they know that they are not needing themselves. They need OCP to be there. They need many other businesses to be there. So that's the conversation tonight.
And if OCP is there, and if the policies are right, and if the African Development Bank and IFAD are there taking losses and providing guarantees, then in theory you have a product, right? That an investor, a big investor, they don't even need to know all the details, that they need to know what the risk profile is, and that it's been brought way down. Is that how you see this, Shalini, or do you think that this is going to be more in the realm of SDG bonds or green bonds or
No.
an ESG play?
No.
How do you see it?
No, definitely not. That's not scalable again. That's another set of pilots that we all tried and didn't get very far with. But I think it's exactly, I don't have a whole lot to say because I agree with what Agnes said. It has to start with government. It has to start with building that bottom of the stack. But maybe I'm a mild skeptic that the top of the stack will just show up. I think we have to be able to translate into a business case for businesses. So the challenge is today, a lot of these supply chains don't go into Africa. Those decisions of where those supply chains go to source are not made by corporate or sustainability. They're made by the procurement guy who's making the decision of where to source from. So I think there is still work to be done between us getting the thing together and then knowing who to talk to in the private sector and opening their eyes and helping them understand this. So it is still work that needs to be done. It won't happen automatically.
Well, maybe as we think about getting toward the end of the panel here, we can just talk about the context for a second, because you brought up supply chains. You're right that maybe the procurement guy is the one who would make those decisions based on various cost factors. Now it is more of a corporate decision because there's a geopolitical contest. People are saying we need to nearshore, or we need to friendshore. We need to bring some of these things back, right? So there's that element of it. Of course, there's climate and how climate is affecting these very farmers we're talking about and their businesses pretty fundamentally. And then there's what we started with, which is the political backdrop around development assistance, the very governments that fund the IFADs and World Banks and others of the world who are potentially pulling back. You know, every year I do a very scary thing, which is I write a prediction article for the year ahead. And I publish this for experts like yourselves who know a lot about it, so it's scary to write it. But I really thought about it, and this year I predict that we have reached peak official development assistance. That this is the peak. We will not go beyond around $220 billion. So there are many other sources of funds, many others. There's non-OECD countries that are doing more. You know, India, Turkey, the Gulf countries, many more, South Korea and more. There's philanthropy. I recently interviewed Howard Buffett. He and his family will give away $150 billion when Warren Buffett dies, more than most governments. You've got 17 billionaires now worth over $100 billion, who if they start giving would be at the scale of the Gates Foundation. So you have other newer sources, but ODA, what we've all long relied on in this space, is probably trending down. So we have a climate challenge ahead of us, we've got a political funding challenge ahead of us, and we have a geopolitical contest which is changing how a lot of these markets work. So I guess I wonder, could we say something about the context, given that we're here in Davos at a forum that's going to talk a lot about those very points? Anyone want to jump in on those? Go ahead, Shalini.
I'll just say one quick thing. I spend a lot of my time working with consumer product companies and retailers and their sourcing teams and procurement teams. I think if we are to make that argument, the thing that is, it is not the argument about 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line. They don't think that far down, just to be honest, right? They think, but they act with the 1 year or 2 years, and that's the reality of business. But what does resonate is resilience. And supply chain leaders, procurement leaders, people working in the space are seeing not just geopolitical volatility, climate volatility. The main terms, unpredictability and volatility, is the thing that is really at the crux of what is driving shifts in strategy for many players in this space. And so I think that is a space for us to occupy and provide a solution to unlock action and financing, is by helping folks understand not just how this creates a better future, not just how it improves productivity, but how it can drive resilience. That would be my one thought.
Alvaro?
Well, perhaps I read your prediction, and I'm looking forward to our bilateral conversation on that. So,
Me too.
I think for sure food security will continue to be at the top, but in terms probably of security, conflict, geopolitical issues, more than actually the resilience or the medium-term development. That's something that is still uncertain. Obviously, sustainability might be also there into questions. I think those two aspects are still more uncertain, but for sure, something that still resonates a lot, and for sure in Africa, is after what happened with Ukraine and some of the shocks into the global food value chain, that still is there. And I think the priority of food security and agriculture will remain. I'm not sure about the international funding versus humanitarian versus development. That could be a question, but still, I believe that there's echoes of what happened in terms of the disruption to global food value chains, and how much of countries can be self-sustainable. That question still resonates a lot with many of the leaders I continue discussing.
Okay. Elias, do you have a final thought for us as we wrap up here?
Well, I agree that, I mean, in order to achieve scale, we need the private sector to be more present, right? But I'll just maybe insist on what I said earlier. I think many of the solutions are already there because innovation is local and a lot is happening on the fields, right? And what we need is really how to connect the dots and how to bring some collaboration in a scalable mode, right? That's what we are trying to do. We think there is a lot still to do, but in my view, capital is not really the bottleneck. The bottleneck is really to change the perception and representation and see really the business opportunity behind.
Agnes.
I do think that the whole world is engaged in unsustainable development. Unsustainable development. Whether you're living in the West, you are in unsustainable development. It's just not possible that we continue living as we do in the developed world now that we know what we know. But so is Africa, and other underdeveloped countries also are living in unsustainable development, wherever we call it, unsustainable underdevelopment. It also does undermine our world. So I do think we need to find a balance either way. And that, for those balances to be found, we need to have the right transitions. Transitions in the food system, transitions in the energy system, and transitions in so many other places. And I guess we need to give ourselves a window of opportunity in terms of how these transitions get funded, irrespective of where. Well, how do they get funded so that we get to a more sustainable world? And again, irrespective of where. That's the question in the midst, the elephant in the room.
I think you're right, and I would just add, I shared some of the real challenges that this agenda faces, but there's some great opportunities too. You mentioned, a company in Ivory Coast, right, that's really transforming the value chain for farmers there. These kinds of companies exist now because of widespread mobile telephony. Internet penetration rates are going like crazy. It's one of the great trends we've seen, including in the continent of Africa. Digital identification, being able to ID people, directly dealing with that customer, no matter how small scale that farmer is. And there's lots of now retail businesses that are working even at scale for addressing farmers. So I think there are some really positive trends in the business environment that ought to help companies, even very small scale ones. If you look at the emerging tech space with tokenization and cryptocurrency, can you get transaction costs way down and have more credibility in transactions? If you think about artificial intelligence and all the tools you could bring to farmers. So we have both headwinds and tailwinds at this moment. And it's probably going to be a time, as you say, of real volatility and uncertainty. But we should also make it a time of ambition, which is what I love about this 2x30 idea, right? That even in the face of all of this, we're going to try and find a new way forward and to think about one of the key elements, which is how much are we actually investing in something that ought to be a top priority for the world. So with that, please join me in thanking this panel. We have one more conversation. I know that we have Hodan Osman with us. Yeah, would you like to introduce her? Yeah, I can say a word. Hodan, as you probably know, is the president of the Somali Development and Reconstruction Bank, and you're going to close out our program all by yourself with all these chairs. But please.
Okay. I like abundance, so it's fine. No, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to close. I think it's good to wrap up. I can, synthesize everybody's strong points made and sound smart myself, even though I'm just repeating your points, so thank you for that. Thank you to Atlas as well for this, really ambitious goal that they put out there, and I think it's challenging us all to meet it. I think part of what I wanted to do as my wrap up, as everybody was talking, a lot of what was everyone saying was definitely resonating with me, especially coming from Somalia, which, as you know, is quite a difficult and complex context. And I think why use that as a case study? I think because of the difficulty of it. I think it manifests both the opportunities and challenges that we talked about in agriculture. And really, when you look at it, Somalia is also the second most climate vulnerable country, and 70% of our population is at risk. So the place that it's probably the place that is most in need, and the place that we really should invest the most and take the most risk in. So I think it does actually stand as a good case study that we can talk about today. Because I think when you look at Somalia, the opportunities are quite vast when it comes to agriculture. We have significant arable land. We have, livestock, one of the highest per capita. I think it's like 4 animals, per person. In terms of fisheries, it's like more than 3,000 kilometers in coastline, the largest coastline in Africa, and potential for over 200,000 metric ton of tuna. And right now, less than 10% of that is actually being, fished and brought out. So when you look at that, there is quite a lot of opportunity to do there, but how do we actually harness these opportunities? So I think I want to just bring that out as a problem and really, put that out there to see how we can solve this together. Because in the sense that, the last 10 years in Somalia has been transformative. One of the most recent things that we did was achieve debt relief. Our debt to GDP is now less than 5%, so that allows us to get access to financing. Part of the reason why the government then decided to revitalize the development bank to be solving these issues. So one of the first few things I spent doing this year is really looking at the productive sectors and really trying to understand, okay, where can we invest in? One of the areas I want to throw out as an example is fishery. Like I said, an area that has high potential, but where do we start across that whole value chains? I talk to exporters and they're like, oh, well, we can get trade financing, we can export, there's enough demand out there, but one of the issues that we're having is on the supply side. We can't meet the demand to get it out. But what's happening on the supply side? So there's lots of small artisan and fishermen there. I think I talked to over 100 of them to try and understand what's going on. And these are, small fishermen that are going out in their small little boats, no equipment. I think some of them even told me they don't have a compass. I think they use the sun to figure out where to go and come back, something that I don't quite understand. So even trying to coordinate all these artisanal fishermen that they pay to get their supply from, but then there's no cooling and there's no storage for them to store this fish for them to be able to get it out. And there's no roads for them to have the transport to then be able to kind of export this fish out, or not just export, for even for domestic consumption that needs cooling. So if you look at it, even if we're looking at processing, that requires energy. Somalia has one of the highest electricity costs in the world, so that again comes in a problem. And I think that's one of the things that I think I'm echoing that said across the panel about us needing a more holistic solution and an ecosystem approach, because what part of that value chain now am I going to invest in? Am I going to target trade finance? Am I doing processing? Am I doing the supply side? Actually, yes, I have to do everything. And I have to think about the enablers. I have to think about the roads. I have to think about the energy in order to bring it together. So this becomes a very dedicated strategy that you have to do and have very focused, which requires lots of investment. So now when we talk about financing, okay, where is the financing for all of this coming from? If you look at our commercial banks, which have actually been doing quite well, doubling their capital, I think in the past 4 years, showing the economic growth that's happening. But if you look at how much of their lending portfolio is actually going into agriculture, it's less than 2% of their lending portfolio that is going into agriculture. So where is the financing then going to go to that fisherman? And I don't particularly blame the banks for that reason. I think it's for us to kind of show them that this is a profitable alternative for them. And right now it's not. Because what is this commercial bank going to do? Invest across the whole value chain? Are they going to invest in the public infrastructure? No. So how do we make this a viable product, for that commercial bank, for them to come into it? And I think here's where we kind of start looking at, okay, what do we need to do? What is the task kind of ahead of us? And I think one of the things that we talked about today, and this ambitious goal of doubling the investment, I think that's fantastic and a great start. But more so, I would say, we need to also then think about, because if we're just doubling the number of investments is not enough, because we're just doubling the same old way we're doing things. It's the same institutions that's delivering things using the same way. So how do we start to do things differently? And I think one of the biggest things for me is take more risk. And that's something that I'm not seeing. Like, who's taking the risk to invest in the fishery sector of Somalia? Or whose job is it to take that risk, right? So I think really looking at, can IFAD take more risk in that area? I don't know. I know actually IFC is not here. I was going to give them a hard time because they've been in Somalia for more than 7 years and yet to have an investment. And it's like, well, what is it going to take for you guys to take that kind of risk in this place to do this? So I think being able to take more risk into these areas and invest in that sector, I think that's one for me. So can we double the investment, but then make sure that we're doing things differently by being able to take more risk? The other thing I would say as well is, like, we need to make this, as I said, attractive for the private sector. And how do we do that? And yes, we can talk about blended finance, we can talk about guarantees, but I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know how much guarantee I can offer commercial banks to come invest in our fishing sector. I don't think enough guarantee is going to make them get there. So I don't think that's the thing. So we really do need to think about alternative financing. And I'm happy to hear that IFAD is doing direct financing, because when I talk about direct financing in Somalia, I get the World Bank and others saying, oh, you're distorting the market. But honestly, maybe the market needs to be disturbed. Like, maybe we need to bring in capital that's affordable, capital that's cheap, capital that's patient, because these are the sections that we're talking about. So it does require alternative financing. So we do need to think about, what does that alternative financing look like that we're able to bring it into these areas? So that's the second thing. And I think third, again, I really love what the panel was talking about in terms of, like, the ecosystem approach and this holistic approach to it. And who are the drivers? I would say I am. Well, policymakers in a way, sorry. Like, we are the drivers of this in a way, and that's why it is a holistic approach, because it's unfair to put, the investment in the whole sector on just DFIs, on just, the private sector, on just this. Somebody has to be coming in and convening it. And I think here's the roles that we can all play, and these roles are evident in the panel that we have. And the roles that I'm talking about, we're looking at who are the risk takers in this space, right? So we do need the risk takers to come in and do that and really think about it. Like, honestly, IFAD, are you risk takers? I think you have to really think about that, right? And these institutions, if they're in positions to be able to do that. Sorry to put you on the spot. You're the only DFI here. And then also figure out, okay, well, if those institutions are risk takers, who are the scalers? Like, who are the ones that are going to come in and be able to scale the kind of innovations or the kind of initiatives that the risk takers are able to start? And then we also need to think about, like, who are the innovators in this space as well. And I really liked, some of the things around the panel that we're talking about bringing startups in. And that's some of the stuff that we're working in at our development bank, in the sense that, instead of hiring, traditional consultants to write us up a policy or strategy, we're trying to find out startups that have already figured this out. Startups spend a lot of their times figuring out the problem. So why not bring them in as partners? Why not bring them as service providers and stuff, and really look at how they can partner with us on these specific problems? So we found some really great fintechs and really great agriculture startups that are doing stuff with irrigations that are super interesting, and working with them. And who are the conveners or the drivers or the policymakers, and getting them to come into that space, and who are the enablers as well. So just really thinking about these roles and where we fit into these roles. And I think you were saying, in terms of, like, that requires us giving up some control and requires us figuring out, like, where does my role start and where does your role end? So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for this panel. I did learn a lot. I'm presenting my problem in our case in Somalia and how to really address this in investment. I look forward to Atlas and what comes from there, and seeing, hopefully we can, double our investments. Thank you, everyone.
I'll use this one, sorry. So that concludes our evening, or at least that part of your evening. I just wanted to associate two persons who have been the co-chairs for the Atlas initiative. Pascal Lamy, who's the vice president of the Paris Peace Forum, and Ibrahim Mayaki from the African Union, who's been very consistent and persistent in supporting the Atlas initiative. I also would like to deliver good news, on which we will then close, which is that the IFC, which was supposed to be here, couldn't be with us tonight, has already announced that they were doubling their investment towards 2030. So the 2x30 is off to a good start. Thank you very much.